For much of the post-Soviet era, Ukraine was caught between Russia and the West. And as such, Russia's orientation often depended on the president of the day. In the mid-2000s, President Viktor Yushchenko applied to join NATO and the EU, but his plans were scuppered by the election of Viktor Yanukovych in 2010, who preferred to maintain Ukraine's neutrality and was generally a bit more pro-Putin. Putin's invasion of this year has obviously changed all of that though, and while Ukraine's accession into NATO is still an open question, in March, Zelensky officially applied to join the EU, and candidate status was granted just a couple of months later. However, while there's certainly an appetite for Ukraine's accession, Ukraine is a massive country in its own right, and the EU would need to reform in order to accommodate it. So, in today's video, we're going to be looking at exactly that. What reforms the EU would need to make in order to accept Ukraine in as a fellow member. Okay, so the first thing to point out is that Ukraine is a pretty huge country by European standards. If Ukraine were to join the EU, it would immediately become the 5th largest country by population size, and the largest new EU member state since Spain joined in 1986. And more than that, with over 600,000 square kilometers of land, Ukraine would also have the largest landmass of any country in the EU, if we exclude France's overseas departments, with Ukraine also having the largest area of arable land. And its sheer size is important, because as a big country, Ukraine would be given a relatively influential voice in the parliament and council, where seats are allocated according to population size, which would seriously shift the balance of power in the EU from the west to the east. So let's consider those two institutions, and let's start with the European Parliament. Now, the big question here is how many seats Ukraine would be allocated in the European Parliament. Now, in general, EU countries with larger populations are assigned more MEPs than smaller ones, with the caveat that less populous member states are allocated more seats per capita than bigger ones, due to the principle of digressive proportionality. In terms of seats though, Ukraine would be somewhere between Poland, which has 52 seats, and Spain, which has 59. Obviously, this is a pretty large number, but it would also lead to the European Parliament exceeding its treaty limit of 751 MPs. Therefore, the European Parliament would either have to be enlarged, or the number of seats that other EU member states have would have to be proportionally diluted in order to free up more seats for Ukraine. So it's clear that with Ukraine's entry, some new maths would need to be done. But what about in the European Council? Well, the main thing here is qualified majority voting, otherwise known as QMV, which is used for certain council-level decisions, including the EU budget. With QMV, an EU Council decision must be approved by 55% of member states, representing at least 65% of the EU population. Ukraine would naturally get 9% of the votes, which is about the same as Poland's voting weight today. But at the same time, the voting shares of other member states would decrease. Germany, for example, would go from 18.6% to 16.9%. And together, Poland and Ukraine would have about the same voting weight as Germany. Clearly then, Ukraine would carry significant political weight in Europe, tipping the balance of power towards Central and Eastern Europe. Finally, let's take a look at the European Commission. Currently, the Commission has 27 members, equal to the number of EU member states, with each overseeing one specific policy portfolio. Now, to avoid appointing commissioners to increasingly irrelevant policy areas, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has proposed maintaining the long-standing rule of one country, one commissioner, but having two commissioners assigned to the same policy portfolio. So it's likely that if Ukraine were to join, we could see two ministers sharing one more important portfolio. That's all of the branches of the EU covered. However, there's one more thing worth looking at, and that's how Ukraine's accession would affect the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. The CAP is actually one of the founding policies of the EU, established in the Treaty of Rome of 1957. And that's perhaps unsurprising when you consider that agricultural expenditure accounts for 30% of the EU's budget and is a deciding factor in determining net contributor and beneficiary positions. The current arrangement generally sees EU agricultural subsidies paid as direct payments per hectare, which means that more land means more payments. Agriculture is also a big political topic in the EU of its own right, given the political capital enjoyed by farmers across the continent. Now, as previously stated, Ukraine would enter the bloc as the state with the largest area of arable land in the EU, with an estimated 42 million hectares. And at present, 32 million of those hectares are currently cultivated, representing an area larger than the entirety of Italy. And accordingly, Ukraine has even been nicknamed the breadbasket of Europe, with agricultural products being Ukraine's most important export. In fact, in 2021, they totaled $27.8 billion, accounting for 41% of the country's $68 billion in total overall exports. Ukraine was also among the top 3 grain exporters globally, and has been a global leader in areas like soybean and sunflower oil production. And with increases in efficiency aided by EU funds, these numbers could become even larger. As such, Ukraine's accession would definitely disrupt the common agricultural policy for 2 reasons. First, and most importantly, its agricultural industry is disproportionately massive to the rest of the EU, which would throw off all kinds of maths. Secondly, though, Ukrainian agricultural companies, which include a lot of large state-owned enterprises and agricultural holding companies with farms significantly larger than 10,000 hectares in size, are already globally competitive. And that's not something that's necessarily true for most other EU states. Most farmers inside the CAP are reliant on EU subsidies and tariff-non-tariff trade barriers. So, under the current CAP system of direct payments, Ukraine would receive large individual and total transfers, which seems a bit bizarre given that they're already making solid profits. Consequently, many inside the EU can't see Ukraine joining without a reform of CAP, perhaps replacing the current area-based agricultural subsidies in favour of defined ecological and environmental objectives. All in all, many of the reforms implied by Ukraine's accession would most likely require some sort of treaty change. And this is what Olaf Scholz and many others have been calling for, with the German Chancellor arguing that even the European treaties aren't set in stone. Nonetheless, this is a tall order for the EU, especially given that Europe's experience of treaty change since the aborted constitutional treaty of the mid-2000s hasn't been overly positive. Thanks for watching TLDR on Nebula. You can find more ad-free content right here by clicking the link to our channel.